Thank you so much for joining this webinar, and thank you for making the time to do some big picture listening and thinking about the Australian child sexual abuse attitudes, knowledge and response study. We want to have a conversation about what we've learnt, and especially what we want to take from this study in order to inform our actions. I'm reminding you that this is the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, and we want to take things forward in an active way. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and celebrate the many traditional owners of the lands throughout Australia from wherever you're coming from. Pay our respects to ancestors of this country and elders past and present. We recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, culture and law have existed within Australia continuously for over 65,000 years. And we also acknowledge the leadership, that collective leadership that has been part of the design and development of this study and the conclusions that have been drawn. So it's really exciting to be able to acknowledge and welcome that input. I'd also like to honour the lived and living expertise of all victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, harnessing all ages, cultures, abilities and backgrounds, and commit to substantially addressing the harm of child sexual abuse now and well into the future. We recognise that there are children and young people today who are experiencing sexual abuse, and we dedicate ourselves to doing all we can to promote their effective protection and care. I'd also like to recognise that it's Pride Month this month, and it's important to us that people of all experiences and diversities and backgrounds and situations are welcome and are celebrated. Let me tell you about the National Centre if you don't know. It was founded in late 2021 through a consortium of the Australian Childhood Foundation, the Blue Knot Foundation and the Healing Foundation. And as the leaders of those three organisations are joining us today, it's really exciting to be acknowledging their foundational leadership in the National Centre. The Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse called for the setting up of the National Centre to commission research, build workforce capability, raise community awareness, lead and collaborate for system change. So about the National Centre, you can find out more on our website, but we are striving to combine the different knowledges that are brought to bear on the challenge of child sexual abuse, including lived and living experience, cultural knowledges, research and theory, practice knowledge and procedural knowledge, and that it's in this integration and system synthesis, I guess, and systematic consideration of all those different perspectives that we can land and find and grow new understandings. So just respect all of those parts of the sector. And we know from our previous webinars that we do get representation across all of those areas when we hold these webinars. So welcome, whoever you are and wherever you're from. Can I just remind you, in the process of thinking about this work, that it can be challenging and emotionally confronting. And so we encourage you to kind of monitor your own experience of what's happening and monitor your thoughts and thinking and responses. And if you need to, reach out for support. This data that you're going to hear about today might in itself be confronting, particularly where there's disappointing feedback about what Australia understands about child sexual abuse. So we just encourage you to really monitor your own experiences, and if you need to, follow up with some support. Thank you. I'm wanting to now introduce this session and tell you what we're going to do. So essentially we are very keen to encourage you to post questions as you listen to the conversation and the data as it's presented through the Q&A, and they'll be inserted throughout the discussion as best we can. We often have way too many questions to be able to be answered, but you're encouraged to do that. We're recording the session, so if you miss the end bit or you aren't able to be here throughout, you'll be able to download the session later. So this In Conversation brings together the CEOs of the National Centre's 3 founding partners, the Australian Childhood Foundation, Blue Knot Foundation and the Healing Foundation. But can I say that Shannon Dodson, who's the CEO at the Healing Foundation, is unfortunately very unwell today and is not able to join us. So whilst she's been part of the design and development of today's seminar and also the findings and discussions that we've had, she's not able to share in the conversation today, so we wish her well. I'd just also like to recognise Joe Tucci's, the late Joe Tucci's leadership in the design and development of this study, and also recognise the input of Fiona Cornforth, who was the original CEO of the Healing Foundation, involved in planning and developing this community attitude study, and just recognise that this has been a piece of really important work for the National Centre, seminal work really, over the last 2 years. So let me introduce you to the panellists. Dr. Kathy Kesselman AM is the president of the Blue Knot Foundation. She's the chair of the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. She's a medical practitioner and she's a lived experience of complex trauma. She's been a driving force within Blue Knot and previously ASCA for over 2 decades and has held a number of board and key representative roles within the mental health and related sector. Kathy is co-author of a range of seminal Blue Knot publications and guidelines. She's a prominent voice in the media and at conferences, and a national advocate for trauma-informed transformational changes and informed responsiveness to people experiencing impacts of complex trauma. Welcome, Kathy. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Janice Mitchell is the CEO of the Australian Childhood Foundation. She's National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse board member, and she's the director of the Centre for Excellence in Therapeutic Care. Janice is a social worker and has experience in child protection, high-risk adolescence, public policy analysis, program development and evaluation, and has extensive experience in the development of innovative therapeutic programs for traumatised children and young people. Janice has a master's degree examining policy and practice underpinning therapeutic care initiatives in Australia, and she's also an adjunct associate professor with the Southern Cross University. Welcome, Janice. And our third panellist was going to be our fourth if we'd had Shannon. Professor Andrea De Silva is the Director of Knowledge Generation Research and Evaluation at the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. She's an experienced applied research professional, knowledge generator and thought leader with over 20 years of experience working across diverse areas of public health, prevention, social justice and inequalities. Andrea uses her expertise and experience to create evidence-based services, policies and laws, and drive system reforms to address barriers that harm, marginalise and oppress. She's led research teams in top-tier universities and previously held roles as research director in several Victorian public sector organisations. It's awesome to have you, Andrea, presenting today and leading this work. So that's our panel. And we are keen to move straight into giving you an overview of Community Attitude Study, the study aims, methodology, key findings and implications, and a little bit of background about where it sits in the broader scope internationally as well. So despite the Royal Commission and many inquiries and studies and reports, the recent Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study tells us that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys in Australia experience child sexual abuse before the age of 18. So the Community Attitude Study confirms that people have an awareness of the scale of the problem. It's not hidden. The National Centre has outlined 7 challenges through our Here for Change strategy, that need to underpin our collective efforts about what needs to change. And so I'm going to hand over to Andrea now to talk about what we found in this study. Tell us about the study and some of what we found. So over to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Leanne. Hello, everybody. Thanks for dialing in to hear about this study. And really, it's a privilege to be here on this panel. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm dialing in from, which is the Wathaurong Nation in Victoria, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the those with lived and living experience of child sexual abuse, and also acknowledge the participation of all of the community members who took part in the study that I'm going to speak about. So thanks very much. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of some of the key findings from the study, and really just try to set the scene around what the findings are, what the study is all about, and how we came to have this conversation. So thanks, Joe. I'll move to the next slide. Okay, thank you. When the study was initiated, it started with a bit of a review, or not a bit of a review, a comprehensive review of the scientific literature to see if there was an existing instrument that could be used to collect the data around the community's knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions around child sexual abuse. And a review was done from 2000 to, we extended it all the way to the end of 2023 to see what was published, whether there was existing instruments. It was determined that there was no existing instrument that would be fit for purpose. But what was identified has been incorporated into what was developed as a bespoke instrument, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. What we did do, though, is review the data from the published studies to get a sense of what is the global state of the evidence around the community's attitudes and perceptions towards child sexual abuse. So there were 49 studies that had been published in the 23 years that we reviewed. 36 of those were published from 2016. So there's been a slow increase in publications around this, but it's largely an understudied area around the community's attitudes and perceptions globally. And the highest number of publications was only as recent as 2021. So it's been a slow trickle, but starting to increase. Those studies reported on data from over 23,000 participants from 25 countries. Four of those studies were based in Australia. So we didn't have a lot of Australian data to compare to, and globally spread across 25 countries. I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the findings from that global literature to assist in our interpretation of the Australian data, which we're going to talk about. So it gives us a backdrop to get an understanding of where Australia sits. When we looked at that international literature, which does include 4 Australian studies, there was some concerningly low levels of knowledge identified and harmful perceptions and attitudes. And some of those relate to limited awareness of the participants that perpetrators of child sexual abuse are typically known to the victim. There was also evidence that there's limited understanding of the complex relational dynamics, such as structural power inequality, dependence, and close emotional bonds between victims and perpetrators. We saw there was entrenched gender stereotypes of victims and perpetrators, and also entrenched stereotypes about perpetrators being mentally ill or having uncontrollable urges that mean they'll reoffend. The evidence base identifies victim blaming attitudes that may be especially harmful to adolescent victims of child sexual abuse. There were also misperceptions or limited knowledge about children's vulnerability to being sexually abused. And there was a widespread inability to identify indicators of child sexual abuse in the absence of physical injuries. So parents or workers being able to see the signs of child sexual abuse. Next slide, thanks. Some of the other findings from the global synthesis of the evidence was that there were entrenched and substantial stigma associated with experiencing child sexual abuse, and that it continues in many countries around the world. and that this is having an impact on adverse outcomes for victims and broader family, kinship, and community networks. Globally, there's also a relatively sound recognition of the harm caused by child sexual abuse, but this was largely restricted to short-term impacts in childhood, as opposed to over the life course and into adulthood. It was clear that the disclosure process is not well understood and generally is a particular blind spot for parents. Studies suggest that parents have limited understanding that children might make and then retract a disclosure, or that they might be prevented from disclosing by their abuser. Many parents expect that their children would tell them if something was happening or if they were being sexually abused, which we know is in direct contradiction to the extensive evidence around how long it takes for victims and survivors to disclose their abuse. The evidence shows that a substantial proportion of adults, many of whom are parents, will dismiss children's credibility in truth-telling when they disclose abusive incidents, or they're suspicious or questioning of why a child might say that they're being sexually abused. There was widespread support for prevention education targeting children, but there was some concern about what that education might expose children to and how those conversations might potentially have negative side effects on their children. There was also inclusion or focus of knowledge, understanding, and attitudes related to adult victims of child sexual abuse, which the finding was that it was largely missing in the evidence base around child sexual abuse. So that's an area where there's even more limited evidence. Thanks, Jo. So with that global backdrop, alongside that, the current study had been identified and really was being developed in the sense of with the aim to benchmark Australians' attitudes towards, knowledge of, and capacity to respond to child sexual abuse, victims and survivors' experiences and needs, and harmful sexual behaviours in children and young people. We'll go to the next slide, thanks. As I said, while doing the literature review, it was clear that there wasn't an instrument already available and published and validated to collect this data in Australia for this purpose. So, over a year of development it has taken to develop this questionnaire. It had multiple rounds of pilot testing, psychometric testing, refinement. It was piloted with over 1,000 people in different stages, till we got to a point of a final instrument. And that final instrument is really a balance between everything that we wanted to know from the study, the burden on participants, the sensitivity of the type of questions that could be asked, ethical approval for the conduct of the research study. So it takes us to a point, but then, we need to think about what to do next, where to go deeper into some areas where we might ask different questions next time round. The expectation is also that we'll repeat this survey in 2 years, and ideally we would repeat it routinely over time to allow this benchmark to tell us whether things are changing in Australia with activity that we'll be doing. So we got to the point in December last year, we finally got to the point of collecting data. So we did engage through this process with the market research company, they worked with us to develop the research instrument and then to collect the data. The data was collected through online questionnaire through a network of established research panels across all Australian states and territories. So when we talk about the community's responses here, these are responses from people who were registered on research panels across all states and territories. It wasn't not random digit dialing or intercept interviews. It was through people registered on online panels. Through the questionnaire, we asked about 8 key topics, and they're shown there. The topics were the prevalence of child sexual abuse, attitudes and myths towards child sexual abuse, awareness and knowledge, discovery or disclosure of current or recent child sexual abuse, awareness and understanding of lived and living experiences, people's capacity to understand and respond to adult with lived experience, prevention of child sexual abuse, and harmful sexual behaviours. And we ask these questions both through individual experience of what they might have experienced themselves, or through a series of hypothetical questions that we'll put to participants to respond to. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so now I'm going to get to some of what happened next. So data was collected from over 4,000 people nationally across Australia. When we release the report on this data, it will be released as a nationally representative sample, which means the raw data from over 4,000 people will be weighted such that it reflects the geographic distribution, the age and gender distribution of the Australian population as we have from the census data. So we will be publishing this as a nationally representative sample. And that will represent the distribution. Geographic distribution is about 2/3 in metropolitan versus regional areas. About just over half of the sample are parents and carers. 6% identify as from the LGBTIQ+ community. 13% identified through the survey as themselves being victims or survivors of child sexual abuse. We had the age distribution there and gender. We did have more gender options, and 14% identified speaking a language other than English. 4% of these respondents identified Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. 12% identified living with a disability, and 24% were born outside of Australia. And really, we look at all of this to tell us how representative of the Australian community is this sample, so that when we talk about this being a community attitude study, how reflective of it is it? So that gives us a sense of how much it mirrors the Australian community. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk through some of the key findings now, and some of these I'll present a little bit of data, but largely these are just the high-level key messages and key findings from the study, so that we can set the scene for the conversation we're going to have. So what we did find from the study is that the community's awareness of child sexual abuse is high, but many think it isn't an issue they need to worry about. Next slide, Jo. When we say that, because the community was aware that child sexual abuse is prevalent, they knew that more boys and girls are sexually abused, but they did underestimate the prevalence in non-binary children substantially. Virtually everybody knew about child sexual abuse. They had reasonable knowledge about who perpetrates it. They knew that it was largely perpetrated by adults in close proximity to the children, and they knew largely where it was happening. Most people, so about 60%, were sure that that they knew somebody, they were either certain or pretty confident they knew someone who was a victim survivor of child sexual abuse. But many in the community also thought that it wasn't really an issue that they needed to worry about, and personally that it didn't impact them, and it doesn't happen where they live. And when we asked these questions, we also saw a lot of neutral responses. People were unsure. They didn't really know whether it happened where they lived as well. Next slide, thanks, Jo. When we asked them about attitudes and a series of myths, and their responses showed us that there were levels of victim blaming and problematic attitudes towards victims of child sexual abuse, particularly adolescent victims. And whilst not in the majority, there was still a concerning level of respondents holding these views. Next slide. Some of these victim blaming attitudes, this is just a selection, where respondents believed that, they blamed victims where, for examples are what adolescent girls, for what they were wearing, for older children not resisting the sexual advances of adults. They had views around children who were acting in what they consider seductive manner, and that children for being disobedient. Thanks, Jo. In addition to that, some community members don't believe or are uncertain if they should believe children when they disclose being a victim of child sexual abuse. Next slide. What we did see is that a substantial proportion of the community were questioning children's reliability and credibility when they disclosed being a victim of child sexual abuse. And this was seen particularly in male respondents and those who were in the younger age of the community members. So coupled with the victim blaming attitudes, this doubting or questioning the truthfulness of children and young people may be experienced more by females and adolescent victims. And this can have detrimental impacts on the child's safety, psychological health, well-being, and future disclosures. Next slide. So I'm just going to run through quickly before we move to the group discussion around some of the other findings. Some of the other findings were that most people in the community felt they didn't know how to prevent or keep children safe from child sexual abuse. They saw a role for many parts of society and the community to be involved in prevention. They wanted more to be done. They thought there was a role for government, for educators. They wanted children to be educated, parents and carers to have increased knowledge and awareness. Those were activities that were strongly supported by the study's respondents. And there was also support for services to help adults at risk of committing child sexual abuse. So we asked specifically about that. And this kind of gives us some indication of where prevention activities might be targeted and the support for those activities. Community members' ability to recognise sexualised behaviours as child sexual abuse varied across the different scenarios, and it was influenced by the age of the child, the nature of the behaviour, and who else was involved. So through the questionnaire, we asked different series of questions where people were given hypotheticals or scenarios where a child might be a 10-year-old child versus a 14-year-old child or a 17-year-old child, and we saw different responses for some of those. And some behaviours were erroneously considered child sexual abuse also. So we do have identified some knowledge gaps as well as some blind spots. When we asked about grooming, most, but not all, Australian adults consider grooming to be a form of or part of child sexual abuse. And we did see that some of the established grooming behaviours made most adults suspicious that a child was at risk of being sexually abused, but most adults also had concerning blind spots, which means that they're not alert enough to intervene. They don't see those as risks and are going to intervene to keep a child safe. Next slide. And the last set really is about community members being able to, in their experience of receiving a disclosure or discovering child sexual abuse, or in response to hypothetical scenarios. What we saw was that most community members were more likely to have received an adult disclosure of child sexual abuse rather than a child. So out of the 4,000 respondents, 35% had received an adult disclosure. So an adult had told them that they were a victim or survivor of child sexual abuse, whereas only 9% had received a child disclosure of child sexual abuse. They were much more confident and comfortable responding to an adult victim survivor, but we did see that not all would or know how to provide support or respond compassionately to that victim survivor. And although rare, some did report that they would disconnect or turn away from the victim survivor. Most community members didn't know what to do and were not confident in taking action or providing support if a child was to tell them or they discovered a child was being sexually abused. They lacked confidence to speak to the child. They lacked confidence to speak to the parent or carer about what they, either what the child had disclosed or what they had discovered. In relation to understanding the impacts of child sexual abuse, most community members were aware of the direct impacts on the victim survivor, such as difficulties with relationships, alcohol and substance use, mental health, self-harm, for example, but fewer recognised those longer-term impacts on the basic needs across the lifespan and well into adulthood, such as housing, job security, financial security, or long-term impacts on physical health. And lastly, about 1/3 didn't agree that they understood the impacts well enough to respond. So they acknowledged that they didn't know what those impacts were and able to provide an appropriate response or support for that adult who disclosed child sexual abuse to them. Next slide, thanks. In terms of the implications, what we can draw at this point of this stage of the analysis, these are some of the implications that we take. The community does support and expects action to address child sexual abuse. They are aware of it and they want something to be done. We need to assess the capacity of government and educators to fulfill the role that the community has seen for them. They want children to be educated about certain topics. They want government to do things. We need to assess whether the feasibility of that, given the current society. We can see that action is needed to ensure all adults, particularly parents and carers, are more aware of risks and confident to intervene to protect children and young people, to keep them safe and to prevent child sexual abuse. We did see that based on these findings, there's a high likelihood that disclosing children will go unbelieved and unsupported, perpetuating the lifelong harm of child sexual abuse. Adult victims and survivors may also go unsupported after a disclosure. We need to find ways to enhance capacity and confidence across the community to support victims and survivors and to respond compassionately with a disclosure or discovery of child sexual abuse. We also see that child sexual abuse impacts people across multiple life domains, meaning that all workforces, not just specialised or targeted services, need to be confident in recognising trauma signs and the indicators of child sexual abuse, the presentations of those impacted, and responding appropriately for victims and survivors in childhood and adulthood. Thank you. I think that's the last slide. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, Andrea, thank you. And I will come back to you. I'm sure there's already questions about details. So let me just remind listeners that there is a comprehensive report that will come out with much more detail, obviously, as in due course. We are wanting to have the conversation about the high-level findings now, though, and recognise that there's lots to know and lots of questions that people will have. I'm going to start with Janice because one of the earlier studies that Andrea referred to in terms of community attitudes is led at the Australian Childhood Foundation. So, Janice, can you tell us what's different? Has anything changed?
Andrea, thanks for presenting all of that. It never ceases to amaze me. Having run, I think the 4 studies you looked at that were Australian were the ones that we've run over the last 20, 25 years. And it never ceases to sober and cause for pause and some dismay that we're still here. But I think the timing and the robustness of this tracking, the work that we've done previously has been around child abuse more generally, not specifically child sexual abuse. So I think this has had a much sharper focus. I think, though, that it's telling us the same thing, and it's telling us the same thing despite the recent Australian Child Maltreatment Study that provides robust evidence around the incidence and prevalence, tells us about the long-term consequences. You know, we've run polling studies at the time of when the Governor-General was getting into hot water about a relationship between an adult and a 15-year-old, and he used those words. At that time, there was reporting around system failures causing all sorts of harm to kids. You could not have not turned on the news, picked up a newspaper or listened to the radio and not heard something about the issue of child abuse or child sexual abuse at that time. And when we surveyed people soon after that, a significant proportion of them said they had seen nothing, heard nothing, read nothing. And the data that you've got now just confirms again how difficult it is for the community at large to engage with this as an issue, hold it front of mind, and see that they have a role to play. Because I think, you said before, Andrea, that people have some awareness of it, but it's not happening in my neighbourhood. There's a lot of inconsistencies. Most people knew an adult who'd experienced it, but at the same time we're saying, but it hasn't touched my life. It's not in my neighbourhood. It's not impacting me. Well, if you know someone that's experienced it, by definition, it's in your life and you're being impacted by it. It's really difficult for people to hold that space, and even more so when it comes down to children. And I think, you said it really clearly towards the end, Andrea, that the idea that people want government to do something about it and education of others. People in the community want systems to do something about it. I think that's in part because we don't really understand what kids and adults need that have experienced child sexual abuse, nor do we feel confident or competent to know what our role is, where the bounds of our role sit, and the responsibilities of formal systems and support services to know better. I think when we've done this sort of work before, there is a high level of fear, particularly in relation to children. We've never surveyed people in relation to adult victims and how they've done. So this is a really important piece of research for Australia, because that hasn't been done before here. Ours has been focused on children and the extent to which adults around children feel like they can't intervene because it's the parent's responsibility or the parent's right, or they'll get into trouble, or they're creating trouble, act as active barriers to people wanting to do something, even if they were motivated to do something. They really don't know, and they fear the consequences. So there's a whole lot of barriers. I think that we need to kind of land in amongst this, and you said it really nicely towards the end, Andrea, that there's such a reliance on kids and people disclosing, adults and children disclosing. The responsibility sits with the victim to tell. And whether that's an adult disclosure and we know they're delayed and they're partial and they're retracted, the process of disclosure is so complicated. But there is a responsibility on adults to know the signs, to understand the indicators. If I think about the research that we just did recently with our collective experience, most of the young people who'd been involved in that study talked about the failure of educators, teachers at school to see the complete turnaround in their behaviour, the complete disengagement, the level of distress without verbalising the why, that no one asked them. Their teachers never reached out and said, hey, what's going on? So even professionals fail to recognise the signs, fail to ask the questions. And I think for as long as we expect victims and whether they be children or adults to tell, the onus is on the victim for the help seeking. And I think we've got to turn that around.
Janice, thank you for that really comprehensive observation. And one of the things that you pulled out was the comparison, I guess, between adults' views about children and disclosure and adults' views about adults and disclosure and their responses to that. And I'd come to Kathy and ask your observations about that comparison, Kathy, and what stands out for you about that.
Well, I suppose for me, I've always struggled with why, when something is so prevalent and it has such profound impacts across society, that, we still have such resistance in wanting to know. And we just pretend that this is an issue of someone else out there. But yet, when you look at the figures, it affects us all, and it's in everybody's neighbourhood. And it impacts, each and every person. So, how do we as a society start to be real and actually start to acknowledge what is right in front of us and how people who are impacted not just by child sexual abuse, but by the other violations that often go with it, you know, are people we know. They're our family members, they're our neighbours, they're our friends. And so how can we together start to embrace one another and just be open and honest about the vulnerabilities that causes and the challenges that it leaves us as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a society. And I think it's really about, you know, it's interesting, we had a Royal Commission which went for, you know, 5 or 6 years. And we did see some shift in attitudes, but towards the end of that commission, people were becoming inured by the reporting around that. I had media people saying, "Can you give me another angle? You know, something a bit more interesting," because it was just too confronting to actually. And we saw people turning up every day to talk about how this has impacted their lives. And you could see it just by watching people. And yet somehow we still turn away from it. It's still aversive. So what is that about human beings in their ability to just embrace what's happening and work together in a supportive way to create change? I still struggle to understand that as a fundamental issue.
Kathy, that's right. It is, we're all a bit bamboozled by some of this data. And I see that there are people getting in touch with us, asking some questions specifically. Andrea, I'll come to you around some of the, obviously some more detail around regional representation and people who are from other languages and other migrants and other priority groups, regional, remote, cultural backgrounds, disability, and so on. What can you tell the people today about what, you know, how the data will be shared and how we'll use that to try and think about some responses? Because that's what both Janice and Kathy have raised. You know, well, given that things aren't changing, what are we going to do?
That's a big question, Leanne. Thank you. Well, just back to the question around different parts of the population. So we have structured this survey so we can look at it through various lenses. So people with a disability, culturally diverse, regional, urban. So we will do that analysis, and we're in the process of doing more sophisticated analysis and subgroup analysis. I suppose the question becomes, you know, what we do with that information. So we don't want to marginalize people who might hold different views and say that actually it sits in that part of the community only, or you know, it's young males who have negative attitudes or culturally diverse. What we, I suppose, will look at is how best to develop activities or interventions or actions that reach all parts of the community. If we have a better understanding of the spread and the nature of these responses and the attitudes and the beliefs across the diverse Australian community. The Global Literature Review did tell us that some cultures do hold different views, and that's important for us to understand when we are thinking about shifting the whole Australian community along to reduce problematic attitudes, to go beyond empathy and even compassionate responses into action, so that we can overcome some of those barriers. I think some of the other thing we have to think about is, you know, what happens next after a person discloses, whether it's an adult or a child or it's discovered. And we have to make sure that those are safe spaces for all people in the community, because we know that for some people, a disclosure or a discovery might lead, can and often leads to more problems or harm because of the systems and services that they have to interact with. And we have to think about the the response that people are going to get in all parts of the community, whether they're culturally diverse, whether they have a disability, whether they're Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders. So we need to factor that into our thinking about shifting the community's attitudes, getting them to take action, and then what's going to happen next. Where does that action take them? So I think that assists us, so not to kind of stigmatize or put blame onto different parts of the population when we interrogate the data more deeply, but to have a better understanding and to think about what we're going to do with this evidence as well.
Andrea, there is a sense that one of the barriers, and I'm going to come to you, Kathy, there's a sense that one of the barriers is about shame and stigma. And certainly there looks like there was more compassionate responding to adult disclosures of child sexual abuse than there are to child disclosures, and we need to unpack and understand that more. But what do you think the role of stigma is in the barrier for people knowing that it's happening but acting in a responsive way, in a compassionate and responsive way?
Well, I think people can know it's happening, but that can be an intellectual knowing. Actually engaging relationally and connecting with someone in their pain. And we know that as human beings, we're not very good at that. People will cross the street to avoid someone who's, maybe going through an experience of grief or loss because they don't know what to say. And so it's about obviously overcoming our own aversion to how difficult that is and remembering the most discomfort is sitting with the person who's experienced this. And certainly when survivors experience that degree of stigma and a sense that they're being ostracized, and they're also carrying what often is a very intense feeling of withering shame and self-blame, which many survivors take on, because how does a child make sense of the fact that someone who's meant to be nurturing and caring for them and protecting them is harming them? And often it's, as we know, the vast majority of people who perpetrate child sexual abuse are known to the child. How does the child make sense of that? And so that becomes a very internalized sense of self-blame, which is perpetuated often right into adulthood and often into old age, unless people receive a supportive response, which is not only empathic and compassionate, but really helps people to validate that their reaction is a perfectly normal response to a profoundly abnormal experience.
Yeah.
And so overcoming that shame is an absolutely critical element, but it requires, really empathic, ongoing support with people alongside the survivor.
Thank you. I'll come back to that. I want to ask Janice, though, what are the key barriers to responding to children? This data tells us that there's some unhelpful attitudes, that people don't know, they're not able to pick and respond. They have blind spots and they are unable to attune themselves to what might be risky behaviours of other adults with children and so on. So what do you think gets in the way?
I think it's a good question, Leanne. I think that fundamentally adults believe that adults will take care of kids, be safe with them and protect them. So our default position is always an optimistic one. And it's not that we need to be, what was the slogan? Be alert and not alarmed way back. For another reason, it's not that we need to be engendering fear, but we need to equip everybody with an understanding that this is an issue that lives in our neighbourhoods, in our families, in our streets, in our schools, in our playgrounds, in our sports clubs. It lives everywhere. And that we need to think about the position we're going to take in that. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, and you said it again, Andrea, we found time and time again that significant numbers of people, even if a child does disclose, won't believe them, or a similar proportion are ambivalent about whether they will or they won't. So this whole issue of the credibility of children, and often it's the credibility of children measured against how trustworthy is this child, how much is this child difficult. So if a child's exhibiting trauma-based behaviours and has a reputation that's unhelpful, or has been stigmatised as being a troublemaker, disruptive, all the rest of it, their trauma-based behaviour can actually act as a barrier to being believed, because it takes the legitimacy out of what they say based on what they do. I think the other thing is that what children say are measured against that adult's understanding of who the adults are that are being accused. So that person wouldn't do that. I've known, you know, that's my sister, my brother, my uncle, that's the neighbour, that's my friend, that's the teacher, that's the sports coach. We've had all of our kids go through that club. There's never been an issue. He's a great guy. Whatever it is, we measure a lot about who we understand the alleged perpetrator to be in the way we will give weight to what the child is saying. So there are enormous barriers to, even if a child does disclose, the assessment of the person, the adult that they're telling, as to the weight that they'll give that disclosure and then what action they will do. And it is less often about what it is that's being said, but measured against other characteristics of the child and or the adult that the allegations are being posed towards. And I think for as long as we do that, it's our way of protecting ourselves and minimising the need to sit with the seriousness of what that child's telling us. And it's that reluctance to sit with the reality that this happens. And we have to call it for what it is. You know, when we talk about children, we use language that minimises what is actually going on. We don't, if an adult is raped by another adult, we don't have a lot of difficulty in talking about rape. If a child is raped by an adult, we call that child sexual abuse. We don't call it for what it is. And so there's this whole kind of frame that sits in the community around minimisation of language for calling behaviour that, were it to happen between an adult and an adult, we would have a whole different language frame around it. And we minimise the language that we use to describe and then shape how we're going to respond to the abuse of children.
So do you think, Jo, I'm just going to stay on you, do you think that our response needs to be some kind of language change in the community? Is that where our effort in response to this data should go?
I think that's one response.
Sure.
You know, this is a complex and wicked problem, so there's going to be no single solution. I think that we need to really be prepared to unpack all the richness of the stories and possible hypotheses that this data is showing up to us, and come up with a set of responses that have some internal coherence to them, have some integration to how they relate to each other, and build it out from there. Because, you know, you could go right back to a fundamental child rights perspective and talk about that. Interestingly, that often doesn't work in the favour of children. Children are taught about their rights at school. Children who are at risk, who go home and start to try and exercise their rights or talk about their rights because they're now able to articulate them, are often placed in more risk of the abuse at home, because that conversation, that attempt by them to say, you can't do that, I know my rights kind of thing, can end up with them being further abused, because it escalates and agitates an already risky situation. So I think it's really about getting into the minutiae. These broad-based, yes, we do need a different language frame, but which would be underpinned by a children's rights approach, but we need that and so much more.
Thanks, Janice. I'm going to because I'm going to come back to Andrea around this. That one of the issues that has been important in the data, and I'm lucky because I've got to see it in a bit more detail, so I can ask the question. But has been this issue about a lack of understanding in the participants around the long-term impacts of child sexual abuse. So I wanted to ask Kathy in a minute about support processes and support structures for those who've experienced it. But what can you tell the audience about people's understanding of the impact of child sexual abuse on the children over the lifespan? Sorry.
Thanks, Leanne. I think what we're seeing in our study as well as in the other literature is about their understanding of what it might, the immediate impacts that it might have on the child, and the kind of short-term impacts in terms of substance abuse or mental, poor mental health and things like that. What we are seeing is that those more far-reaching, longer-term impacts, whether they're how trauma is displayed in complex trauma and the lifelong impacts of that, people's understanding of that is more limited. In this study, we have started to look at age-related responses. So, and we're seeing that younger respondents have less of an understanding of those lifelong impacts than older respondents, for example, which may come from life experience and that understanding of the life course itself. But having an understanding that this experience in childhood and the trauma that results from it will affect people's ability to participate in school and their job security and financial stability, which then plays out through a lot of other situations, and homelessness or home housing security is an area that we saw a lesser understanding of those long-term and really, some of the things that are fundamental social determinants of health as well, that we see underpinned so much more across the life course. And that is something that was seen in the global literature, but it's also an area that's just not studied enough. We don't have that empirical evidence in terms of people's understanding and actually exploring it in a scientific research way.
Okay, so Kathy, given the evidence tells us, and one case in point is the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study that gave us an idea about the long-term impacts in health and mental health, for example, for people who had experienced child sexual abuse. What do you think needs to change around the support systems and responses to victims and survivors?
Well, obviously there needs to be a lot better understanding, of course, about all of those long-term impacts. And I'd just like to add a little bit to what Andrea said. I think there's a real lack of understanding about some of the perceived complications of people who've experienced child sexual abuse, such as alcohol, drug misuse, self-harm, suicidality, and the ways people cope with their profound angst and mental distress. People cope as best they can. And these are often, pathologized and judged, just as Janice was saying before about understanding people's behavior. And what is the behavior telling us? Well, the behavior is telling us that someone's experienced often repeated child sexual abuse and complex trauma. And this is not only the impacts of complex trauma paying out, but the way people have tried to cope as well. And we also need to talk about the relational impacts of experiencing child sexual abuse. That obviously that level of betrayal and the distrust that is established when you don't know when the next trauma is going to come sets you up for a lifetime of having challenges in forming, safe and healthy relationships, and later on intimate relationships as well. In terms of support, everyone is unique and an individual, and there's lots of different ways that people respond to sexual abuse depending on their situation. Whether they do disclose, young, whether the response to disclosure, whether abuse is perpetrated by someone with a very close relationship to them within the family, so on and so forth. So there's certainly no single response to this. I suppose the first response is that support needs to be real, genuine, non-judgmental, accepting, validating, believing, and to find out what it is that the person needs, to be guided by the survivor as to where they are and what they feel they need at the time, because there are many, many pathways to healing, and there are lots and lots of different therapies and different approaches, and there's often been a bit of a competition in the therapeutic world about which modality is better and which is more helpful. But the core often for people to recover is the relationship, because people have been harmed in relationship, and healing occurs in relationship, and whether that's a relationship of trust with a friend over time or with a therapist, as well as many, many other ways of working to reconnect the body and the mind, because what trauma does is cause a lack of connection between the systems of the body that often work together. And so bringing them back together, and trauma is often, stored in the body. So unless you respond to the physiological as well as the cognitive, people will struggle to heal and recover. So, I gave you a very secure response to that.
Well, it may have been a circuitous question, but I wonder whether that deep sort of understanding that you just conveyed then about trauma, it kind of is in contrast to some of the attitudes that Andrea spoke about earlier, and I'll come back to you, is in contrast to the victim blaming attitudes, I think you called them, that we saw in this data. And it might be worth coming back to that and trying to understand, that at a very high level, victim blaming attitudes are very persistent, and it appears that that's been borne out in this study in its own way as well. Do you want to make some comments about that, Andrea?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we we have to understand also the society we live in. We live in a sexualized society to some extent, and the attitudes toward, we have gender attitudes towards women, gender inequality. We see age-related differences in the victim-blaming attitudes around adolescents and older children, and their perceived responsibility to resist an adult's advance, for example, or viewing what they're wearing, or how if they're behaving in particular ways. And we see that in other in relation to rape myths and other views of women and sexualized behavior, I guess. So I think that is, and what that points, I guess, is that we're still not focusing on stopping the abusive behavior. We're blaming the victims of the abuse. And so how do we use that information about those victim blaming attitudes and those problematic views to shift people's thinking in a way that's going to prevent the abuse from happening, as opposed to, the fact that they might not believe either what they're seeing because they don't trust their own instinct, or they're not prepared to act and intervene, or they don't believe a child or an adult disclosing to them, or they blame the victim for what has happened. We need to, I suppose, think about how we shift that, how we address that, and that is, I suppose, in the broader context of gender inequality, sexual violence more broadly, and how that might be part of a range of activities around prevention.
I think I'm going to come back to you, Janice, because I think that there is an issue here about focusing on the victim, and you spoke about, everything kind of relying on the victim making a disclosure. Is there some learning that the community needs to understand around perpetrators and how they work, and particularly around grooming and their role in that?
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Look, I think there's two things that the community needs to do. And it goes back to what Kathy was saying. I think we have to support a more compassionate stance for the struggles that people face. We rush to judgment very quickly without asking, hey, are you okay? What's going on? Whether that be a child or an adult. And I think if we were to develop ways of being far more compassionate as a community, we would be far more open to hearing the struggles that people and children have. So I think kind of that as a foundational piece, we've got to find ways to do that. We've just got to find ways. Road rage, everything, we're losing compassion. It's becoming a very adversarial way that we interact in the world now. We're losing that sense of we're here for each other. So we've got to find ways to be compassionate. I think that, the question of grooming and perpetration is absolutely, we need to do something, but we need to do something different to how we've talked about it before. Because the way we've talked about prevention before is arming children with the knowledge to tell someone it's not okay to do what you're doing, and or to alert someone to the fact that something is happening. Now, the jury's out on the effectiveness of those programs. It's contested knowledge and evidence around that. And I think that what hasn't been studied, and I don't know how you do it, but there's enough wisdom in the sector and in the system and in the experience of kids and of practitioners to know that perpetrators use the information that's contained in these programs to manipulate children. So I think the tactics of perpetration now, as well as, if we kind of think in the real world, I'm very old, so in the real world, in the in-person world, there's a dimension to perpetration. But what we know now is that kids don't live just in the physical world. They live in the physical and the virtual world. And, we've got research running at the moment that's showing us, that's being done by a forensic paediatrician, to show us a level of perpetration that starts with a relationship that's developed online and translates. So there's a whole new knowledge base that we need to develop about what grooming means and how that's actually enacted, and the tactics that perpetrators are using in really sophisticated ways to get around what we think are the protections that we're putting in place, which is the education of children to know what's going on and to tell. And I think that the longer we sit in the kind of the world of, cycles of grooming and, in that in-person world, we're missing a big piece of where some of that grooming behaviour is starting.
Yes. Thanks, Janice. What's your thoughts on this, Kathy, in terms of the targeting of community learning? So there's community learning about what's happening to children, but is there community learning around perpetrators and grooming as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole online space is absolutely terrifying. And I think, you know, certainly what I know of parents' awareness is, you know, a level of, and this sounds judgmental, but I think it's factual, a level of complacency and lack of awareness of the age at which children are engaging online, at the age at which they become at risk, and the insidious nature of that risk. And I think, you know, we need to do a lot more about educating the adults in children's worlds to take, you know, leadership in this area, because I think, yeah, just the scale of this is, and the way it's just multiplying exponentially. And so I'm not trying to terrify everyone who's listening here, but I do think as a society, this is something we absolutely need to be completely on top of. And even if we're on top of it, it's really pretty frightening.
Kathy, I think I couldn't agree more. And in our thinking and preparation for today, and just in reviewing the data that we've had, we just recognise and need to say again, responses are going to need to be complex and multiple. There's not just one answer. If we knew that, we would have done it, right? So we need to, and I'm just going to come back to you, Andrea, around and noting that we've got 15 minutes left. So I do want us to start to think about takeaway messages. But I do want to come back to you, Andrea, around this idea about, you know, from your point of view, what are the key takeouts for you from this study and maybe from the conversation, or yeah, what would you like people most to attune to?
Well, I'll just add one thing to what Kathy was saying about the online environment. And what we did see in the study, which I didn't really talk about, is that people did have a high awareness that things were going on online, that children are being approached, that there's sharing of nude images, that there is grooming activity occurring online. But what to do about it, they really didn't know how to act, how to protect their children online and their families was an area that they didn't really know about. In terms of the takeout, I think what we do have is now a really robust and solid benchmark. We have an understanding of where the community is at, where there are attitudes, behaviours, knowledge, limited knowledge, understanding where all that sits. It allows us to measure our effectiveness of the actions we're going to do from here. Like what you know, is it an awareness campaign? Is it a capacity building? Is it how do we increase community's knowledge? It'll be what we need to think about, I guess, is who's going to take responsibility for which actions and who's going to do what. And this allows us to use it as a benchmark to hold ourselves to account, to hold the community to account, to hold everyone to account about changes, about having impacts on addressing this issue. We also have the Australian Childhood Maltreatment study now, which gives us very robust data around the prevalence, which we haven't had before. And we can see we now can't hide behind the fact we don't have the data. We have the data on prevalence. We have the data on the community's attitudes, where they're at, what they want, what they support, and what they understand. And now that is really a really strong, robust, and contemporary platform for us to now initiate a whole lot of activities. So I think for me, that's the takeout. Like, we know how big a problem this is. We now have the evidence to really propel us into action. And if we don't do that, we have to really ask why.
Thank you. And there is some really great advice in the Q&A chats to us around areas for thinking about that, including the legal frameworks around responding to children, and do people know what to do? Like, do they actually know what to do if they hear a disclosure? Janice, can I come to you? What's your kind of takeout message from here? Knowing the study, but also your, lengthy experience in previous studies in this space. What are you wanting to see us do next?
From the National Centre's point of view, or community?
Community.
Yeah, I think what we need to try and do in a myriad of ways is try and maintain community consciousness on the issue. Because what I've seen time and time again is that there is a collective forgetting happens. As the passage of time between the Royal Commission and the present day, and the stories, like Kathy was talking about before, the stories of those survivors, the discomfort that is felt when those stories are given voice in a public domain, we've got to find ways to help guard against that collective forgetting. We've got to find ways to build community. Comfort's the wrong word. We never want the community to feel comfortable with this issue, but comfortable sitting with this issue. Comfortable just with the reality that for children today, and for the adults that were children yesterday, the consequences of us doing nothing are significant. And I think, if we are to unpack the ACMS data even more and think about the compounding numbers of children year on year on year, if we do nothing, that population, the size of those numbers, the numbers of children's lives who are impacted, and the cost to the community in every possible way are huge. And I think we've got to tell that story. We've got to find ways to tell that story to help the community stay engaged.
Thanks, Janice. Kathy, coming to you, what do you, who do you want this message to get to, and what is the key messages that you think this data is giving us?
I mean, the who is everyone, but that's not a very helpful response. I think, the data is critical, but the data on the number of people affected is about human beings. And I think when we look at stats, we forget that when we're saying 28.5% of people are sexually abused, think about the people you know. That's a lot more than the people you know and love. And think about what that means for people's lives and the harm that's reaped if we sit by and continue, not just do nothing, continue to do what we've done, because, as Janice said, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. So we have to do things differently, and we have to be very bold about what we do. And that's certainly what the National Centre has signed up for doing things differently. We need to do things smartly. We need to look at the data, but then look at the human beings and see how we can really change the trajectory for people.
It does actually come back to very human things like addressing blind spots and in taking compassionate stance, and society being real about what's going on.
And this is a pervasive social practice. We have to continue, as Janice said, this public discourse, and it has to be front and centre. Public health issue that we all need to be very, very proactive behind.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. So what are we going to do? What's the next steps so that people know?
So with the next steps with this particular study, we are going to finalise our report and launch that publicly in the near future. We are going to do more and deeper and more sophisticated analysis of the data, where we start to try to understand what is explaining some of the, whether it's the responses or the lack of confidence or the holding of unhelpful or problematic attitude, and start to try to do that in a statistical way and try to make more from the data than we have in looking at individual items, but trying to understand when we look at how much of the variation, for example, we can explain in people's attitudes by the things that we've measured. How much of that are we capturing? Where are the things that we're not seeing, or what are we not identifying that might start to explain why people hold attitudes, or why they don't respond, or why they lack confidence? So that's the analysis we're going to do next, and also look at particular parts of the population and try to see where there are particular or different responses or different concerns that different parts of the population have. We are also going to use that data to identify where we need to do different studies, so qualitative investigations, to allow us to go deeper into some of the issues. As I kind of, when I spoke about the methodology, we had to balance the length of time participants could answer and the nature of the questions and what lends itself to a quantitative questionnaire-based research methodology, versus now we can go deeper into some of these topics and issues using qualitative methods, and to really get some richer data that will assist us to target our activities even better. And then we also need to prepare for running the study again in 2 years. And, we want to show change. So we want to show change. We want to then do it. Ideally, we do it every 2 or 3 years and be able to hopefully track change and make a difference, I guess. So that's what we're doing with this particular study. In terms of the findings at the National Centre, we are mobilising all this data into all of the things that the National Centre does, all of the knowledge resources, all of the training, all of the future research activities. So it's a big task in knowledge mobilisation within the National Centre, as well as all our partners, stakeholders, and getting this evidence base out so that people can use it to inform their own activities.
Okay, so there's a big task ahead, but let's just stop and mark the fact that we have got this data and we have the study and we have some more information to work from, and that we have a community of supporters out there who've got good ideas too about where to take this forward. And I suspect that when the team puts the slideshow back up, to just put what are those little things called? The QR code. But actually, the previous slide has Andrea's email address on it, which is, a way that people might want to provide some advice and input into our thinking about this, because we need to do this together. We need to respond to this together. We're all part of the Australian community and we're all committed to change. So firstly, can I thank Janice and Kathy for their wisdom and their support for this project and their leadership. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne.
And also thank Andrea for her leadership and wisdom in bringing this study to life and the findings to life. And can I thank all of you for making the time to come and listen and engage and think with us about this really challenging problem that we're all dealing with. Give us some feedback if you can. The QR code's there, and we do these seminars, webinars quite regularly. So keep in touch with through our newsletter and through our website about when the next one's coming up. Thank you all very much for your participation and engagement, for your advice and questions. It's been terrific. See you soon.